The afternoon sun filtered through the crystalline dome of the Galactic Military Academy's cafeteria, casting prismatic shadows across the diverse crowd of cadets and officers from 100 different worlds. Lieutenant Jessica Collins stood in the entrance, her shoulders squared beneath her crisp uniform, dark eyes taking in the familiar chaos of lunch hour. She had grown accustomed to being one of the few humans in this prestigious institution, though that didn't make the daily reality any easier. The cafeteria was a marvel of architectural engineering, designed to accommodate beings of all sizes and atmospheric requirements. Floating platforms served as tables for gaseous species, while reinforced titanium benches supported the massive weight of silicon-based life forms. The air was thick with a cacophony of languages, translated seamlessly by the neural implants all Academy members wore. Jessica's steps were measured as she made her way through the crowd, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. The standard-issue nutrient paste on her plate looked particularly unappetizing today, but she had learned to appreciate its efficiency, if not its taste. Her destination was one of the few empty spots at a mixed-species table, where a group of junior officers from various worlds were engaged in animated discussion about tactical theory. She was 3 steps from her goal when a massive figure shifted deliberately into her path. Jessica looked up, into the stern face of Senior Officer Zaxter, his Centaurian heritage evident in his towering height and the iridescent scales that covered his angular features. His forearms were crossed in what she recognized as a posture of confrontation, his upper set resting on his chest while the lower pair gripped the edge of the table. "This section is restricted," Zaxter announced, his translator rendering his words in perfect standard English, though his tone carried untranslated hostility. "Centaurian command personnel only." His eyes, all 3 of them, fixed on Jessica with unmistakable disdain. The cafeteria's ambient noise began to dim as nearby diners noticed the confrontation. Jessica was aware of hundreds of eyes turning in her direction, some curious, others concerned, and a few showing signs of satisfaction at the human's apparent humiliation. She could hear the whispers starting, could sense the subtle shifting of bodies as others prepared for possible conflict. A young Arcturian officer at the next table half rose from her seat, her bioluminescent patches flashing in distress patterns. "Senior Officer, I don't believe there are any official segregation protocols in the," she began, but Zaxter's sharp gesture cut her off. Jessica remained perfectly still, her expression neutral. Her years of military training had taught her the value of patience, and her personal experiences had taught her far more about choosing her battles. The nutrient paste on her tray remained undisturbed, a testament to her steady hands. She studied Zaxter's face, noting the subtle scarring around his left eye, battle marks, old ones, that spoke of past conflicts. The silence in the cafeteria grew heavier as Jessica slowly, deliberately, set her tray down on a nearby empty table. The movement was smooth, controlled, without a hint of the anger or frustration that many expected to see from a human in such a situation. Instead, she reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small, worn piece of paper, actual paper, a rarity in this digital age. The document was clearly old, its edges softened by time and handling. Jessica held it out to Zaxter, not in supplication or challenge, but with the same precise movements she might use to present official orders. Her expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered in her dark eyes, not defiance, but something deeper, more complex. Several nearby officers leaned forward, their various sensory organs straining to see what was written on the mysterious paper. A vegan meditation master, floating serenely nearby in her containment field, adjusted her frequencies to better observe the emotional energy swirling around the scene. Zaxter didn't immediately take the note. His upper arms remained crossed, his lower ones still gripping the table with enough force to leave slight indentations in the reinforced material. His central eye narrowed, focusing on the offered document while his outer eyes remained fixed on Jessica's face, searching for any sign of disrespect or challenge. The moment stretched out, becoming almost unbearable for the observers. A junior Martian cadet dropped his utensil, and the clatter sounded like a thunderclap in the tension-filled silence. Still, Jessica didn't move. She maintained her position, arm extended, the note held steady between her fingers. Her other arm was tucked behind her back in a perfect parade rest stance, her posture regulation perfect. Finally, Zaxter moved. His upper right hand reached out, taking the note with surprising delicacy for such a massive being. Jessica released it without comment and returned to her parade rest position, waiting. She showed no sign of anxiety or impatience, though the entire cafeteria seemed to be holding its collective breath. The Centaurian officer unfolded the paper with methodical precision, his three eyes scanning the contents. The change in his expression was subtle, a slight widening of his central eye, a faint shift in the color of his scales, but to those familiar with Centaurian physiological responses, it was equivalent to a gasp of shock. His hands, all four of them, began to tremble slightly. The paper shook, making a soft rustling sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent cafeteria. Zaxter's eyes moved from the note to Jessica's face, then back to the note, then to her face again. His scales were now cycling through colors rapidly, a sign of intense emotional disturbance. The other diners were frozen in place, their meals forgotten, their attention completely focused on the drama unfolding before them. Even the automated serving units had stopped their rounds, their programming registering the unusual social dynamics and implementing their conflict avoidance protocols. Jessica remained motionless, her gaze fixed straight ahead, neither challenging nor submissive. She was a statue in human form, watching without watching, waiting without impatience. The only movement was the slight rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, steady and controlled. The air in the cafeteria grew thicker with tension as Zaxter continued to stare at the note, his massive frame rigid with what appeared to be shock rather than his earlier hostility. The document in his hand seemed to hold some power over him, transforming his aggressive stance into something entirely different, something that looked remarkably like recognition, and perhaps even fear. The scene had become a tableau, the towering Centaurian officer, the stoic human lieutenant, and a simple piece of paper that seemed to bridge an impossible gap between them. Around them, the diverse assembly of galactic military personnel waited, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, though none of them yet understood exactly what was unfolding before their eyes. Zaxter's central eye closed as the memories flooded back, sharp and vivid as the day they were formed. The tunnels of Proxima Prime stretched before him in his mind's eye, their crystalline walls reflecting the emergency lights and sickly pulses of red. The air had been thick with rock dust and the acrid smell of plasma discharge, making even his enhanced respiratory system strain for every breath. His unit had been pursuing a group of smugglers through the abandoned mining complex when the first charges detonated. The explosion had caught them in a perfect trap, the tunnel ahead collapsed, the one behind followed seconds later. 16 Centaurian warriors, the pride of the 3rd Expeditionary Force, sealed in a tomb of their own making. The memory of his second-in-command's voice crackled through his mind. "Sir, structural integrity at 12% and falling." Varkith had always been precise, even in the face of death. His lower arms had been crushed in the initial collapse, but he had continued to monitor their situation until the end, his scales maintaining their professional blue hue despite the pain. They had tried everything. The reinforced walls of the tunnel, designed to withstand the pressure of deep space mining, proved resistant to their weapons. Their communications equipment, sophisticated as it was, couldn't penetrate the layers of mineral deposits above them. The air recyclers had been damaged, and the remaining oxygen would last perhaps another hour. Zaxter remembered the moment he had accepted their fate. As commanding officer, he had begun composing the death ritual, speaking the ancient words that would commend their spirits to the stellar winds. Around him, his warriors had assumed the position of final honor, their scales shifting to the deep purple of acceptance. That's when they had heard it, a sound southwest out of place. It had seemed like a hallucination at first. The rhythmic impact of primitive tools against the crystal walls, coming from a direction where no tunnel had existed before. The sound had grown louder, more insistent, until suddenly the wall beside them had cracked, then shattered. Through the breach had stepped a figure that, at first, Zaxter had thought must be some kind of combat mechanoid. The being was encased in what looked like badly damaged environmental armor, its surface scarred and melted in places. It moved with purpose but also with obvious difficulty, as if every step caused pain. The figure had surveyed the scene quickly, then spoken in heavily accented but understandable Centaurian, "Follow. Now." Without waiting for a response, it had begun helping the wounded to their feet. When Varkith proved unable to walk, the figure had simply lifted him, a feat that should have been impossible given the Centaurian's mass and the cramped conditions. What followed was a nightmare journey through a hastily carved escape tunnel. The figure led them through passages that seemed to have been cut by hand, using nothing more sophisticated than plasma torches and cutting tools. The work must have taken hours, yet their rescuer had somehow known exactly where to find them. The air grew thinner as they climbed. Several times, the figure stopped to shore up weakening sections of the tunnel with support struts that appeared to have been salvaged from mining equipment. Each time they stopped, Zaxter noticed more details about their mysterious savior, the way the armor's joints were failing, the increasingly labored breathing, the trembling in the limbs that suggested approaching physical collapse. They were about halfway to the surface when the second cave-in began. Zaxter had been helping one of his younger warriors when he heard the ominous cracking above them. He looked up in time to see their rescuer shove 3 Centaurians forward, out of the path of the falling crystal shards. The figure wasn't fast enough to avoid the collapse entirely. The scene was etched into his memory with perfect clarity, the human standing there, armor now torn open in several places, revealing horrifically burned flesh beneath. Yet somehow, she had straightened up and continued leading them forward, leaving a trail of red human blood that steamed slightly in the cold tunnel air. It had taken another 40 minutes to reach the surface. Their rescuer had insisted on staying behind until every Centaurian was safely out, despite Zaxter's attempts to take over the evacuation. Only when the last warrior had emerged into the harsh light of Proxima Prime's binary stars did the human finally allow herself to collapse. The medical teams had been waiting, alerted by some transmission their rescuer must have sent before beginning the rescue. As they had rushed to treat the Centaurian wounded, Zaxter had watched the human being quickly whisked away by a specialized medical unit. Before losing consciousness, she had pressed a piece of paper into his hand, actual paper, a material so archaic he had almost dropped it in surprise. On it were written words that had changed his understanding of humanity forever: the weight of one life outweighs the glory of any victory. The handwriting had been shaky but determined, written by someone who had just spent hours cutting through solid rock to save beings she had never met, from a species known for its general disdain of humans. Zaxter had tried to find out the identity of their rescuer afterward, but the human military had been surprisingly unhelpful. All he could discover was that the soldier had been transferred to an advanced medical facility for extensive reconstruction. The injuries she had sustained, both from the initial rescue and from the secondary collapse, had been severe enough that even modern medical technology would need significant time to repair the damage. Now, standing in the cafeteria with that same note in his hands, Zaxter felt his scales ripple with waves of recognition and shame. The handwriting on the old note matched perfectly with the one he had just been handed. But more than that, he now understood why his efforts to find his rescuer had been so thoroughly blocked. The human military hadn't been protecting information, they had been protecting her privacy, her right to continue serving without being marked by her actions. His outer eyes focused on the insignia on her uniform, noting the subtle markers that indicated her specialization: combat engineering and rescue operations. She had turned her experience into a teaching role, passing on the knowledge that had saved his unit to a new generation of officers. And he had just tried to deny her a seat at a cafeteria table. The silence in the cafeteria took on a different quality as Zaxter's scales shifted through a rapid sequence of colors, finally settling on a deep azure, a hue reserved for moments of profound revelation in Centaurian culture. His hands trembled as he carefully smoothed out both pieces of paper on the table before him, aligning them side by side with military precision. The cafeteria's automated lighting adjusted subtly, compensating for the growing crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather at a respectful distance. A young Arcturian cadet activated her species' natural bioluminescence to get a better look, her antennae quivering with curiosity at the unfolding scene. Jessica remained at parade rest, her posture perfect, but her eyes now held a quiet understanding as she watched Zaxter process the truth before him. The subtle scarring around her hairline caught the light, thin, silvery lines that most would mistake for natural markings, but to someone who had witnessed severe burn trauma, they told a different story. A vegan meditation master, floating nearby in her containment field, emitted soft pulses of empathic energy that rippled through the gathering. The emotional resonance in the room had shifted from hostile tension to something far more complex. The vegan's crystalline structure refracted the light in patterns that seemed to mirror Zaxter's changing scale colors. Zaxter's central eye focused on Jessica's face with new intensity, searching for traces of the soldier he remembered. The environmental suit had been badly damaged that day, its faceplate cracked and clouded, offering only glimpses of the person within. But now, looking at Lieutenant Collins' features, he began to notice small details: the set of her jaw, the particular way she held her shoulders, the unwavering steadiness of her gaze. His upper right hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where a ceremonial scar marked his survival of that day. The gesture caught Jessica's attention, and for a brief moment, her professional mask slipped just enough to reveal a flicker of recognition. She too remembered that scar. She had helped create the emergency pressure seal that had saved his life when his armor failed during their ascent. A drop of moisture fell onto the papers, and Zaxter realized with shock that his central eye was producing tears, a phenomenon so rare among his species that many believed it physically impossible. The liquid left a small, iridescent mark on the older note, its chemical composition causing the aged paper to glow faintly where it had landed. The Centaurian officer's lower arms gripped the edge of the table again, but this time for support rather than intimidation. His massive frame seemed to shrink somehow, not in size but in presence, as the weight of his earlier behavior settled upon him. The disdain he had shown, the casual cruelty of his exclusion, all of it directed at the very being who had risked everything to save him and his unit. A junior Centaurian officer several tables away began to hum the opening notes of the Song of Life Debt, an ancient melody used to acknowledge profound obligation. The sound vibrated at a frequency that caused the crystalline walls to resonate sympathetically, filling the space with harmonic undertones that every Centaurian present would recognize as sacred. Jessica's expression changed almost imperceptibly at the sound. Her knowledge of Centaurian culture would have told her the significance of the moment, but she made no move to acknowledge it. Instead, she remained still, allowing Zaxter the space to process his realization without pressure or expectation. The papers on the table had begun to draw attention from the more technologically inclined species present. In an age of quantum computing and neural interfaces, the presence of physical writing materials was remarkable enough to attract the interest of a hovering Syrian data analyst, whose scanning appendages twitched with the desire to document this unusual form of communication. Zaxter's outer eyes finally lifted from the papers to fully study the woman before him. The differences were striking. Where his memory held images of a broken body and failing armor, he now saw a poised officer in an immaculate uniform. Yet there were similarities too, hidden in plain sight. The same quiet strength that had carved through crystal walls now manifested in her patient stillness. His scales rippled with another wave of color, this time settling into the deep purple of ceremonial recognition. The change was dramatic enough to cause several nearby Centaurian cadets to step back in surprise. This particular shade was reserved for moments of great significance in their culture, typically seen only during the most sacred rites of passage. A subtle shift in the cafeteria's atmospheric processors responded to the increasing number of beings gathering around the scene, automatically adjusting the mix of gases to accommodate the diverse respiratory needs of the crowd. The soft hum of the machinery provided a gentle counterpoint to the continuing resonance of the Life Debt song, which had now been taken up by other Centaurian officers in the room. Zaxter's upper hands moved in a complex pattern, forming the geometric shapes of formal Centaurian sign language. The movements were precise, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. He was composing a recognition address, a formal acknowledgement of identity and worth that dated back to the earliest days of his species' spacefaring history. The significance of his actions rippled through the crowd. Several senior officers of various species activated their recording devices, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would likely appear in future diplomatic and cultural training materials. The intersection of military protocol, personal history, and cultural tradition playing out before them was unprecedented in the Academy's recent history. Jessica's only response to this display was a slight softening around her eyes, a subtle indication that she understood the magnitude of what was happening but chose to maintain her professional demeanor. Her hands remained clasped behind her back, her posture reflecting the same quiet strength that had guided 16 Centaurian warriors to safety through hand-carved tunnels 3 years ago. The temperature in the cafeteria had risen slightly with the press of bodies, causing the environmental systems to cycle more quickly. The sound mingled with the harmonics of the Life Debt song, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as Zaxter completed his recognition address. His scales had settled into a complex pattern of purple and azure, marking this as a moment of both ceremonial significance and personal revelation. Around them, the Academy's usual lunch-hour chaos had transformed into a moment of profound silence, punctuated only by the soft sounds of various species' respiratory systems and the continuing resonance of Centaurian song. The once hostile space had become a crucible of understanding, where prejudice dissolved in the face of remembered courage and present dignity. Jessica finally broke her parade rest stance, her movement drawing every eye in the now silent cafeteria. She pulled out a chair at the table, the soft scrape of metal against floor cutting through the lingering harmonics of the Life Debt song. Her movements were deliberate as she seated herself, smoothing her uniform with practiced precision. "Please sit, Senior Officer Zaxter," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had guided his unit through crystalline tunnels years ago. The translator rendered her words in perfect Centaurian, but she had spoken them in his native tongue, her pronunciation carrying the distinct accent of someone who had learned the language through military service rather than academic study. Zaxter lowered his massive frame into the reinforced chair across from her, his scales still shimming with waves of ceremonial purple. The furniture creaked slightly under his weight, but held firm, Academy engineering at its finest. His 3 eyes remained fixed on her face, as if still trying to reconcile the composed officer before him with his memories of a burned and bleeding savior. Jessica reached up and touched the nearly invisible scar at her hairline, the first voluntary acknowledgement of her past. The regenerative treatment took 23 months, she explained, her tone matter-of-fact. The medical team had to regrow approximately 60% of my external tissue and rebuild several major organs. The neural regeneration alone required 9 separate procedures. A young medical officer from Rigel 4 involuntarily activated her diagnostic sensors, the readings causing her epidermal spots to pulse with professional interest. The extent of reconstruction Jessica described would have pushed the boundaries of even modern medical science. The implications of her survival and recovery rippled through the gathering of medical personnel in the crowd. The hardest part wasn't the physical recovery, Jessica continued, her fingers moving to adjustment her collar insignia. It was convincing the review board to let me return to active duty. They wanted to award me the Galactic Cross and retire me with full honors. A small smile touched her lips. I had to remind them that there's a difference between being decorated and being effective. Her words carried across the cafeteria, each sentence measured and clear. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want medals. What I wanted was to ensure that what happened on Proxima Prime would serve a greater purpose. She gestured to the classroom wing visible through the crystalline dome above. That's why I requested assignment to the Academy's Combat Engineering and Rescue Operations Division. A senior Martian instructor nodded slowly, his crimson skin darkening in understanding. The Academy's Zero program was notorious for its rigorous standards and practical approach to training. Students learned by doing, often in conditions that simulated real emergency scenarios. The program had a reputation for producing officers who could think creatively under pressure. Every species has its strengths, Jessica said, her gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. Centaurians have their warrior traditions and incredible physical resilience. Vegans possess unmatched empathic abilities. Arcturians can process multiple dimensional calculations instinctively. She paused, letting her words sink in. Humans. We adapt. We survive. And most importantly, we learn. The cafeteria's environmental systems hummed softly as they compensated for the increased respiratory activity of the entranced audience. Jessica's words seemed to hang in the air, carried by the lingering resonance of the life debt song. The burns taught me about pain management. The neural damage showed me how to work around physical limitations. The regeneration process gave me insight into recovery protocols. Her voice remained steady, professional, but carried an undertone of passionate conviction. Every moment of that experience now serves to better prepare future officers for the challenges they might face. A group of junior cadets at a nearby table unconsciously straightened their postures, suddenly understanding why their Zero instructor pushed them so hard in practical exercises. The lessons weren't just academic, they were born from lived experience, paid for in blood and pain and years of recovery. I chose to come back without fanfare because effectiveness doesn't require recognition, Jessica continued, her hands folded neatly on the table. Leadership isn't about who you are or what you've done. It's about what you can teach others to become. She glanced at the notes still lying on the table between them. That's why I wrote those words, both then and now. Every life has weight. Every person has value. These aren't just human concepts, they're universal truths. The vegan meditation master's containment field pulsed with approval, her crystalline structure refracting the light in patterns that suggested deep emotional resonance. The empathic waves she emitted carried undertones of respect and understanding, touching each being in the room with the weight of Jessica's words. The Academy exists to bridge gaps between species, to create officers who understand that strength comes in many forms, Jessica said, her voice taking on a teacher's cadence. My scars are just one lesson among many. Every being in this room has something to teach, something to learn. She gestured to her simple cafeteria tray, still sitting untouched on the neighboring table. Even if that lesson begins with sharing a meal. The automated serving units, sensing the shift in atmosphere, had resumed their rounds, their quiet efficiency a counterpoint to the profound significance of the moment. The smell of various species' food preferences mingled in the air, a reminder of the everyday reality of cooperation that the Academy fostered. Jessica's final words carried the weight of both personal truth and universal wisdom. I didn't stay anonymous to hide my actions, but to emphasize that the act itself is what matters, not who performs it. In crisis, we are all simply officers of the galactic fleet, bound by duty and common purpose. Our differences become our strengths, but only if we choose to see beyond them. Zaxter rose from his seat with deliberate ceremony, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. His scales had settled into a permanent shimmer of deep azure, marking a fundamental change in his being. The Centaurian officer stretched to his full height, towering over the cafeteria tables, and executed a perfect ceremonial salute. All four arms moved in precise, ritual patterns that had not been seen in the Academy for generations. The salute he offered was the rite of eternal recognition, a gesture so sacred in Centaurian culture that it had only been recorded 7 times in their 1,000-year history of space travel. The movement created a subtle disturbance in the air, causing the crystalline walls to resonate with a pure, clear tone that spread through the cafeteria. Jessica stood in response, her movement smooth and unhurried. She returned the salute with perfect form, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of Centaurian military customs that went far beyond standard diplomatic training. Her execution of the ritual matched his in precision, though adapted for her human physiology. The vegan meditation master's containment field pulsed with a brilliant light, capturing the emotional resonance of the moment. The energy patterns she recorded would later be preserved in the Academy's cultural archives, a testament to the profound shift in understanding that had occurred in this space. Lieutenant Collins, Zaxter spoke, his voice carrying the formal tones of ceremonial address. I hereby request your permission to establish a new training protocol within the Academy. His scales rippled with determination as he continued, a joint program between Centaurian combat specialists and Human Engineering Corps. Jessica's expression remained professional, but her eyes showed understanding of the magnitude of his request. Such collaboration between their species had never been attempted before. The Centaurians had always maintained strict separation in their military training programs. The program would focus on adaptive problem-solving under extreme conditions, Zaxter elaborated, his central eye fixed on Jessica while his outer eyes swept the crowd of witnesses. We would combine Centaurian warrior traditions with human ingenuity. Your experience, your methods, could save countless lives across all species. Academy administrators present in the cafeteria began activating their data tablets, recognizing that they were witnessing not just a personal reconciliation, but a historic shift in interspecies military cooperation. The soft glow of their devices created a ring of light around the scene. Jessica nodded once, decisively. Proposal accepted, Senior Officer. I suggest we begin with a practical demonstration. She gestured to her still untouched meal tray. Perhaps over lunch. I believe there's room at this table for officers of all species who wish to learn from each other. Zaxter's scales flushed with approval as he gestured to the nearby Arcturian cadets, who had been watching the exchange with rapt attention. Join us, he commanded, but his tone carried an unprecedented warmth. Today, we begin to rewrite the protocols of cooperation. The impact of their exchange rippled through the Academy like a shockwave. Within hours, the story had spread to every corner of the massive complex. By evening, the Academy's Administrative Council had convened an emergency session to formalize the proposed joint training program. 1 week later, Jessica stood before her first mixed-species training class. The lecture hall contained an unprecedented combination of Centaurian warriors and human engineers, along with observers from 12 other species. She began her lesson not with words, but by playing the recorded harmonics of the Life Debt song from the cafeteria. The training program, officially designated as the Proxima Protocol, quickly became the most requested specialization at the Academy. Its success led to the establishment of similar programs across the galaxy, each one breaking down centuries-old barriers between species. Zaxter himself became a permanent instructor alongside Jessica, their contrasting approaches creating a teaching dynamic that produced exceptional officers. Their shared experiences formed the foundation of a new military doctrine, one that valued adaptation and cooperation over traditional species-based segregation. The original notes, both the one from Proxima Prime and its cafeteria counterpart, were preserved in the Academy's Central Archive, sealed in a crystal display case. Below them, a simple plaque bore the words that had sparked this transformation: the weight of one life outweighs the glory of any victory. Jessica continued her work without seeking acclaim, but her impact was undeniable. The next generation of officers graduated from the Academy with a new understanding of interspecies cooperation. The incident in the cafeteria became known as the Collins Paradigm, a case study in how individual actions could transform institutional prejudices. 5 years after that pivotal day in the cafeteria, the Galactic Fleet faced its first major crisis under the new protocol. A vegan colony ship suffered catastrophic system failure in the heart of an asteroid field. The rescue operation that followed demonstrated the full potential of the Proxima Protocol, as teams of Centaurian warriors and human engineers worked in seamless coordination to save every soul aboard. Jessica watched the rescue operation from the Academy's command center, standing shoulder to shoulder with Zaxter. Neither of them spoke as the combined rescue teams deployed their skills with precision and creativity. They didn't need to, the success of their shared vision played out before them on the tactical displays. As the last shuttle of survivors docked safely at the rescue station, Zaxter turned to Jessica and offered one final salute. This time, it wasn't a gesture of ceremony or obligation, but one of profound respect between equals. The sound of his scales shifting to deep azure resonated through the command center, carrying with it the harmony of the Life Debt song, a melody that had become the unofficial anthem of their joint program. Jessica returned the salute with the same quiet dignity she had shown that day in the cafeteria. The legacy of her actions on Proxima Prime had grown far beyond a single act of heroism. It had become a foundation for lasting change, proof that the barriers between species could be broken not through grand gestures, but through individual acts of courage and understanding. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a confrontation in a cafeteria had evolved into a fundamental shift in how the galaxy's military forces approached both training and operations. The Collins paradigm became required study at every military academy in known space, a testament to the power of one person's choice to value lives over recognition, and cooperation over tradition.